The snowstorm was relentless, an unforgiving blanket of white that seemed to stretch on forever. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, and the wind howled through the desolate stretch of highway, carrying with it the bitter sting of winter. It was the kind of night when the world feels distant, when the harshness of the elements makes you feel insignificant. In the middle of this vast, wintry wilderness, two small German shepherd puppies were abandoned without a second thought. The two puppies, no older than 8 weeks, lay shivering on the snow-covered ground. Their little bodies were coated with frost, and their fur, though thick, was no match for the biting cold. They had been left here, out in the open, with no shelter, no warmth, and no food. The person who had discarded them didn't seem to care about their fate. To them, the puppies were nothing more than a burden, something to get rid of, perhaps because they had grown too big or were no longer wanted. But to the puppies, this moment was nothing short of terrifying. They had known only a short time of love and warmth before they found themselves in this cruel place. The snowflakes fell in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, covering their small forms like a blanket that promised nothing but more cold and isolation. With each gust of wind, their tiny bodies trembled harder. They instinctively huddled together for warmth, their instincts kicking in, telling them to survive. But survival was becoming more and more uncertain. The snow didn't stop falling, and the cold didn't relent. They couldn't keep track of time. There was no concept of morning or night. There was only the endless chill and the feeling of being abandoned in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. The wind howled through the trees in the distance, and the sound of it was louder than their tiny, desperate whimpers. They tried calling out, lifting their heads weakly, but their voices were weak and drowned out by the storm. Their little paws struggled to move, but they were too weak, too exhausted, too frozen to find shelter or safety. They didn't understand what had happened, why they had been left behind, or if anyone would come to help them. All they knew was that they were cold, scared, and alone in the vast, empty landscape. The puppy's fur was thick, but not enough to fend off the freezing winds. Every breath they took seemed to freeze in the air before dissipating into the storm. The snow, which had started gently falling at first, now blustered fiercely around them, smothering everything in sight. It was as if the world was disappearing under the weight of the snow, leaving the puppies trapped in an endless white void. At that moment, they were nothing but two small, fragile lives, struggling to hold on in the face of overwhelming odds. Their bodies grew weaker with each passing minute. As the cold continued to numb them, it became harder to stay awake, harder to keep their eyes open. The storm seemed to be closing in around them, and the fear that they might never be found crept deeper into their hearts. They could feel the weight of the world pressing down on them, and with it, the gnawing realization that if no one came for them soon, they would not survive the night. But as the storm raged on, they held on, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, would hear their cries and come to their rescue. The storm continued to rage through the night, its icy fingers sweeping across the land with no mercy. The howling winds tore through the barren trees, rattling their skeletal branches and filling the air with a chilling scream. The snowflakes fell in dense sheets, swirling around the two puppies, who lay huddled together for warmth, their once vibrant coats now matted and wet with frost. Their tiny bodies trembled uncontrollably, and the warmth they had once known was now a distant memory. One of the puppies, a small female with a patch of white on her chest, lifted her head with great effort. Her eyes, barely able to stay open, scanned the empty road ahead, but there was nothing, only the swirling chaos of snow and wind. She whimpered weakly, the sound barely more than a breath, as her head sagged back onto her brother's side. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from the overwhelming cold that gnawed at her very bones. The other puppy, a male with darker fur, shifted slightly, his nose twitching in the snow. He felt the same cold, the same despair, but his instinct was still alive. He was the first to whimper louder, his voice trembling as if asking for help. It was a desperate sound, a cry not just of hunger or pain, but of the primal need for connection. He didn't know who or what might hear him, but his heart told him that without someone, anyone, to intervene, they wouldn't survive. For a moment, the silence returned, thick and oppressive, only broken by the wind's eerie whistling through the trees. The puppy's whimper, faint as it was, seemed to fade into the storm, swallowed by the immensity of the night. Yet deep in the distance, something changed. There was a noise, a sound that did not belong to the storm, something human and alive. It was the distant rumble of an engine. John the trucker was miles away from his planned route, making his way along a back road that was covered in snow, hoping to reach the nearest town before the worst of the storm hit. He was a seasoned driver, used to the brutal winter conditions, but tonight something felt off. The road, which should have been quiet, had been eerily deserted. The storm had picked up speed, reducing visibility to almost zero. The truck's headlights cast long shadows as they sliced through the falling snow, and as the wind whipped around him, John felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. Then, in the middle of the storm, he heard it, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable once his ears registered it. A faint, high-pitched whimper. It was so soft, so fragile, that he almost dismissed it as the wind or the sound of his truck's engine. But there it was again. This time, clearer, sharper. The desperate cry of a living creature in need. John's hand tightened on the steering wheel. His instincts, honed over years of driving in treacherous conditions, told him that something wasn't right. He couldn't ignore it. He slowed the truck, scanning the snow-covered landscape ahead. There, barely visible in the headlights, was a dark shape lying near the side of the road. He hit the brakes hard, the tires screeching as he skidded to a stop. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. The cry hadn't been his imagination. There was something out there, something alive. Without thinking, John threw open the truck door and plunged into the snow, the cold biting through his clothes in an instant. His boots sank into the deep drifts, and he squinted through the swirling snow, trying to make out what he had heard. The wind howled, making it almost impossible to hear anything beyond its roar. But then, just above the storm's fury, he heard it again, this time unmistakable. A small, fragile whimper, a cry for help that no man could ignore. He knew he had to act fast. The puppy's lives were hanging by a thread, and he was the only one who could hear them. John's heart raced as he forced his way through the deep snow, his boots sinking with each step. The wind was so fierce it felt like needles against his skin, and the snow lashed his face as he pushed forward. His breath came in sharp gasps, each exhale turning to mist in the icy air. He could barely see anything in the swirling storm, but the sound of the faint whimpering kept him focused, guiding him like a beacon through the chaos. As he moved closer, the sound grew louder, more desperate, and his stomach clenched with urgency. He could feel his fingers going numb, but he didn't stop. Each second mattered. The thought of what might be waiting for him, what he might find, spurred him on. His breath caught as he finally made out two small shapes in the snow ahead, nearly invisible against the white backdrop. There, almost hidden in the blanket of snow, were the puppies. They were lying side by side, their little bodies so weak they could barely lift their heads. Their fur, once thick and strong, was now matted and frozen, caked in ice. The male puppy, who had cried out earlier, was barely able to open his eyes. The female, whose small form trembled violently, looked up at John with a gaze that seemed to plead for help. John's stomach tightened at the sight of them. He dropped to his knees in the snow without hesitation, his hands trembling from both the cold and the realization of how dire the situation was. The puppies, barely able to move, were so weak from the cold and hunger that they hardly reacted to his presence. Their breathing was shallow, their tiny bodies barely holding on to life. The male puppy let out a faint, pitiful whimper, his eyes half-lidded, before his head dropped back into the snow. He couldn't let them die here, not in the snow, not alone. With a surge of adrenaline, John scooped up the smaller of the two, the female, into his arms. She was light, frail. Her body felt as though it could crumble in his hands. Her coat, though once beautiful, was now a patchwork of wet fur and frozen clumps. But her breathing was still faint, still a sign of life, and that was all he needed. He wrapped her carefully in the blanket he kept in the truck for emergencies, holding her as gently as he could. The male puppy, though still alive, was too weak to move, his little body barely able to hold itself upright. John reached down, his heart aching as he carefully lifted the second puppy into his arms. The two were so fragile, so close to death, that every move he made felt like a race against time. He could feel the chill seeping through his jacket, but the cold didn't matter now. He returned to his truck, where the heat from the engine's interior felt like a distant dream. The storm outside was relentless, but inside the truck, the warmth was a lifeline. The puppies whimpered weakly in his arms as he gently placed them on the passenger seat. They didn't have the energy to move, but the warmth seemed to comfort them, and their trembling slowly eased. John didn't hesitate. He started the engine and shifted the truck into gear, praying that he could get them to safety in time. The road was treacherous, visibility was near zero, but he drove like a man possessed, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if his life depended on it. In a way, it did. The puppies' lives depended on him now, and there was no way he was willing to let them die in the storm. As he drove through the storm, the puppies' breathing became more even. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were still alive, still fighting, and that meant he had to keep going, no matter the cost. John's truck rumbled through the snowstorm, its headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkened world. The storm outside was relentless, but the warmth inside the truck cabin felt like a temporary reprieve from the hellish cold that had nearly claimed the puppies' lives. As he glanced over at the two fragile creatures in the passenger seat, a sense of urgency filled him. Every minute counted. He had no idea how much longer they could survive in their weakened state. He couldn't afford to waste time. The male puppy, still in John's lap, was barely conscious, his little body limp and shivering. The female, her fragile frame curled up in the blanket, was more alert but still too weak to move on her own. John had wrapped them both in the spare blankets he kept in his truck, but they were far from warm enough. He kept them close to his body, constantly shifting them to keep them as warm as possible. The faintest tremor in his hands only fueled the anxiety building in his chest. It was strange, the way he felt such a deep connection to them already. He was just a trucker on a regular haul, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this tiny, fragile moment, was something more than a chance encounter. He had been driving this route for years, but never before had he come across something so dire, so urgent. He had to save them. It was that simple. Despite the treacherous conditions, John pushed on, his eyes darting from the road to the puppies. The male whimpered softly, his eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. It was a sound of distress, a soft, heartbreaking plea for help that made John's chest tighten. He couldn't stand to see them like this. They were so small, so vulnerable. Their lives had already been stolen by the storm, by the brutal cold. But somehow, someway, he had to give them a chance. After what felt like an eternity, the small town's faint lights appeared on the horizon, a beacon of hope in the swirling snow. John's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if the puppies would make it much longer, but he had to get them to a vet. The nearest clinic wasn't far, and it was still open. His mind raced as he navigated the icy road, his focus unwavering. The storm had made everything treacherous, but the thought of losing the puppies pushed him forward. He pulled into the clinic's parking lot, the tires skidding slightly as he braked hard. The building stood dark and quiet, but the welcoming light from inside shone through the windows. Without waiting, John threw open the truck door and rushed out into the snow. The cold hit him like a wall, but he didn't care. Every step felt like a race against time. He had no idea how much longer they could hold on. He carried the puppies carefully in his arms, the weight of their fragile bodies a reminder of just how close they were to death. As he entered the clinic, he saw a few staff members still inside, preparing to close for the night. But when they saw the puppies, their faces immediately shifted from indifference to concern. One of the nurses rushed forward, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the pups, barely conscious and covered in frost. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking as she took the female puppy from John's arms. "Get them inside, now." The team sprang into action, their hands gentle but swift as they rushed the puppies to the back, preparing to assess their condition. John followed, standing in the doorway, his chest tight with worry. He had never been one to show emotion easily, but the sight of the puppies so small and fragile had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Lambert, appeared moments later, taking a look at the puppies. "They're lucky you found them," she said softly, her eyes scanning their condition. "They're cold, dehydrated, and severely malnourished, but they're not gone yet. We can save them." John exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A flicker of hope ignited in him. It wasn't too late. The puppies had a chance, and that chance was because of him. The hours dragged by in the clinic as the medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize the puppies. John paced back and forth in the waiting area, his eyes flicking nervously toward the back door every few seconds. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Despite all the miles he had driven, despite all the challenges he had faced on the road, nothing had prepared him for this, watching two tiny lives teeter on the edge of survival. Dr. Lambert had assured him that they were doing everything they could, but there was still no guarantee. The puppies were so weak, so close to death, that their survival depended on how quickly their bodies could recover from the freezing cold and the malnutrition they had suffered. John's mind raced as he sat down, his hands rubbing his face in frustration. He kept thinking back to that moment when he had first heard their cries in the storm. Had he acted fast enough? Had he done everything right? The female puppy had started to stir when they arrived, but the male had remained mostly unresponsive. John couldn't stop thinking about that helpless look in his eyes, the way he had barely managed to whimper when John first found him. The image haunted him, and he wondered if he had made it in time or if it was too late for the little guy. Every moment felt like a test of patience and hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Lambert returned to the waiting area. She was holding the female puppy in her arms, and though the little one was still weak, there was a noticeable improvement in her condition. Her breathing was steadier, and the faint tremor that had plagued her body had subsided slightly. John stood up immediately, his heart leaping in his chest. "She's out of immediate danger," Dr. Lambert said, her voice calm but filled with a hint of relief. "She's not completely in the clear, but the worst is over for her. The malnutrition and the cold took a toll, but she's responding well to the fluids and care we've given her." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his eyes briefly closing in relief. "What about the other one?" he asked, his voice tight. Dr. Lambert glanced down at the puppy in her arms, a somber look crossing her face. "He's still critical. We're doing everything we can. He's been severely hypothermic, and his body is having trouble adjusting. But there's a chance. We're keeping him on IV fluids and warming him up slowly. His chances will improve if he can hold on through the night." The weight of those words hung heavily in the air. John nodded, though his heart was still heavy with worry. The storm outside hadn't abated, and the clinic's isolation felt even more suffocating now. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, both for the puppies and for him. It was no longer just a question of saving their lives. It was a question of whether they could recover enough to thrive. Time passed slowly. John tried to distract himself with small talk with the staff, but his mind was constantly with the puppies. He had saved them from the storm, but now it was in their hands. They were still so fragile, so vulnerable. As much as he wished he could take them home and protect them from the world, he knew they needed more than that. They needed medical care, they needed time, and they needed to fight for themselves. Hours later, Dr. Lambert returned to give an update. "We've managed to stabilize him," she said, with a cautious but genuine smile. "He's responding to the treatment, and his temperature is rising slowly. It's still touch and go, but I'm optimistic. I think he's going to make it." John felt like a weight had been lifted off his chest. He stood up, his legs feeling weak from the tension that had been building all night. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Dr. Lambert nodded, her face softening. "You saved them. Without you, they wouldn't have made it through the storm. They owe their lives to you." John couldn't help but smile, though it was bittersweet. He had done the right thing, but the journey wasn't over. The puppies had a long road ahead of them, and so did he. But for the first time since he had found them in the snow, he allowed himself to believe that they were going to be okay. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. The next few days passed in a blur of medical treatments, check-ins, and quiet, anxious waiting. John remained a constant presence at the clinic, visiting the puppies every day, watching over them as they slowly began to regain their strength. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving behind a frosty silence, but the puppies' fight was far from over. They were both still fragile, each of them struggling to adjust after everything they had been through. But there were signs of hope, and that was enough to keep John by their side. The female puppy, who had been the first to show signs of improvement, was growing stronger each day. Her coat, once matted and frozen, was beginning to regain its softness, and her eyes, which had been dull and clouded, were now clear and alert. She would look up at John when he visited, her small tail wagging weakly in greeting. Though she was still shaky on her feet, it was clear she had the will to live. The male puppy, however, remained more of a mystery. His body had taken a much harder hit from the freezing cold, and his recovery was slower. He still had moments of weakness, his little body shaking despite the warmth of the blankets and the steady IV fluids. But his eyes, though tired, held a spark of determination. He had made it this far. He wasn't giving up now. John watched over them like a guardian, making sure they received the best care the clinic had to offer. He had taken on the responsibility of their well-being, even though he knew there was still much work to be done. But as each day passed, he saw improvements. The male puppy began to show signs of movement, his little legs twitching as he tried to lift his body, to walk, to be active again. It was small, almost imperceptible progress, but it was progress nonetheless. He also noticed how the puppies were starting to form a bond, as if they knew they had been saved together. The male puppy would occasionally nuzzle up to his sister, and she would return the gesture with a gentle lick to his ear. They seemed to draw strength from one another, two survivors fighting to overcome the odds that had been stacked against them. On the fourth day, John was sitting quietly in the clinic's waiting room when Dr. Lambert approached him with a cautious smile. "I have some good news," she said, her voice steady but warm. "The male puppy is doing much better. His temperature has stabilized, and his response to treatment is promising. We're still keeping a close eye on him, but I think we can start introducing some solid food tomorrow." John felt a surge of relief wash over him, his breath catching in his throat. "So he's going to be okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Lambert nodded. "I believe so. It will take time, but he's pulling through. You did a great thing, bringing them in when you did. Without you, I'm not sure they would have had a chance." John's chest tightened with emotion as he absorbed her words. He hadn't done it for recognition, but hearing the doctor's praise made him realize just how close the puppies had come to slipping away forever. They had been so close to death, yet now they were on the path to recovery. It was a feeling of triumph that he could never have imagined when he had first found them, shivering in the snow. That evening, as John sat by the puppy's side, he watched the small pair slowly drift into sleep, curled up together for warmth. The road ahead was still long, but the difference was clear now. They were no longer on the brink of death. They had been given a second chance, and with that, John could finally exhale, knowing that the puppies had a future. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a moment of quiet contentment. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they were closer than they had ever been. And that was all that mattered. The days that followed brought steady improvements for both puppies. Their recovery, though still slow, was undeniable. John continued to visit them every day, spending hours by their side as they grew stronger with each passing moment. It was during one of these visits that the real shift began, the moment when the puppies went from fragile, sickly creatures to playful, energetic survivors. The female puppy, now with her coat gleaming and her eyes bright, was the first to start showing signs of her playful nature. She would wag her tail excitedly when John entered the room, her little body squirming in her blanket as if she couldn't contain her joy. Her sisterly instincts kicked in as she nuzzled the male puppy, encouraging him to stand to walk, to explore the world that had once been out of reach. The male puppy, though still a little wobbly, had started to show a spark of energy. He followed his sister's lead, trying to crawl to her, his legs unsteady but determined. John watched in awe as the two of them began to interact, their playful barks and little wagging tails a sign of how far they had come. They were no longer the weak, helpless creatures he had found in the snow. They were beginning to live, to thrive, and that brought John a feeling of fulfillment he hadn't anticipated. Dr. Lambert's updates were becoming increasingly optimistic. Their immune systems are bouncing back, she told him one afternoon, her face lit with satisfaction. We can start weaning them off the IV fluids soon, and once they're fully recovered, we can think about finding them a home. John's heart skipped at the mention of a new home. He had known this day would come, the day when the puppies would be strong enough to leave the clinic and move on to a family who could care for them. But now, with their little personalities beginning to emerge, John couldn't shake the thought that he might be the one to offer them that home. Every day spent with the puppies deepened the connection he felt for them. The thought of them going to someone else filled him with a sense of loss he hadn't expected. He'd never been one to take on the responsibility of a pet, but these puppies had changed something in him. They had needed him, and he had delivered. They were more than just animals to him now. They were family. As the puppies grew stronger, they began to explore the clinic's back room more, toddling around with clumsy, joyful energy. John would often sit in a chair near their playpen, watching them chase after each other, play fighting, and tumbling over one another in a haze of puppy bliss. It was a beautiful sight, the first real signs of their playful, loving nature emerging. They were free now, no longer held hostage by the cold, the snow, or the desperate fight for survival. One day, after the puppies had finished a round of playful wrestling, the male puppy climbed up to John's lap, his little body still shaky but determined. He nuzzled into John's chest, a soft whimper escaping his throat as he looked up at him with those bright, soulful eyes. John smiled, his heart swelling with affection. He had saved them, but somewhere along the way, they had saved him too. I don't know what I'm going to do when you two are fully recovered, John murmured, more to himself than to the puppies, but I'm not sure I'm ready to let you go. That moment, as the puppies settled against him, curled up together for a nap, marked a turning point in John's journey. He had never thought of himself as someone who needed companionship, but these two small creatures had taught him the value of loyalty, resilience, and love. He wasn't just their rescuer anymore, he was their family. The thought of finding them a new home, a life filled with love and care, no longer seemed like an inevitable future. It felt like a choice, one that John had to make. The puppies had changed his world, and now he had to decide if he was ready to make them a permanent part of it. The decision had been brewing in John's mind for days, but it wasn't until the puppies were fully recovered that it truly crystallized. When he first found them, they were broken, their small, trembling bodies near the edge of death. Now, as they ran circles around his legs, their little barks and wagging tails full of life and joy, John couldn't imagine a life without them. They had become more than just animals he'd rescued. They had become a part of his world, a part of his family. The thought of handing them over to someone else, no matter how loving their future home might be, filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He had saved them from the snow, pulled them from the brink of death, and watched them grow stronger each day. How could he let them go now? They were no longer helpless, cold, and alone. They were playful, healthy, and full of promise, and they had forged an unbreakable bond with him in the process. Dr. Lambert had been the first to suggest finding the puppies a home. The clinic was not a permanent place for them, and there were always more animals in need of care. But as the days passed, and John grew closer to the puppies, he started to consider something he hadn't before. What if he was the one to give them that home? What if they had already found their place right here with him? It wasn't an easy decision. John had never been the type to make hasty choices, and he knew that adopting two puppies would change his life in ways he couldn't even fully comprehend. It would mean early mornings, long walks, and a commitment to caring for them every day, in sickness and in health. But the bond he shared with them, especially after everything they had been through together, felt undeniable. They had chosen him just as much as he had chosen to save them. One afternoon, as the puppies frolicked around the clinic's backyard, John stood at the fence, watching them play. The male puppy darted around in circles, his little legs faster than they had been days ago, and the female puppy followed suit, her energy matching his every move. They were unstoppable now, their earlier frailty replaced by a vibrant energy that made John's heart swell. The decision was clear, though it had taken him some time to admit it to himself. He was ready to give them a home. Not just any home, but a home where they would be loved, cared for, and protected. A home where they would be a part of something bigger than themselves, a family. He approached Dr. Lambert later that day, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice slightly uncertain. "I don't think I can let them go. I want to adopt them." Dr. Lambert looked at him, her expression softening with understanding. "I thought you might say that," she said with a smile. "You've done more than just save them, John. You've become their family. I can see the bond you share. If you're ready, I know they'll be lucky to have you." John smiled, his heart light with relief. He hadn't known what to expect when he voiced his thoughts, but hearing Dr. Lambert's approval made him realize that this was the right choice. These puppies weren't just the survivors of a storm, they were his companions, and he would make sure they had everything they needed for the rest of their lives. As he left the clinic later that evening, the two puppies by his side, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. The snowstorm had brought them into his life, but it was the love and care they shared now that would carry them through the years to come. They had a second chance at life, and so did he. Together, they would face whatever the future held, no longer separated by the cold, but united as a family, one born not of blood, but of fate, survival, and unconditional love.